Well, very briefly, I'll run through several ways in which 1916 influenced events in the Free State, later Republic. First of all, of course, it reinforced partition. Now, partition would have come about anyway. We all know that. It had been established in 1914. But the fact that the Easter Rising led to the general election of 1918, led to a massive Sinn Féin majority, with the result that all Irish Nationalist MPs, except the 6 surviving Redmondites, abstained from Westminster, meant that the way in which partition was imposed became even more easily or naturally a unionist method or solution than might have been the case otherwise. One little possibly controversial point, since there was a request for controversy earlier. We all know that the Easter rebels in 1916 proclaimed a republic for all Ireland, cherishing all children of the nation equally, meaning unionists and nationalists alike. In practice, of course, their rising was a southern rising, with no plans whatever for a rising in Ulster. Ulster was to be left alone. The Ulster rebels, insofar as there were any, would somehow or other, unspecified, make their way to the line of the Shannon and would there join Connaught rebels and make sure that nothing happened in Ulster. Whatever about their ideals, their plans, their practice was partitionist. So it was established long before 1916, recognised by the Easter rebels, but was consolidated by the Rising and its aftermath. The Rising, of course, established a tradition of violence, or, in some people's eyes, re-established a tradition of violence, leading indirectly to the War of Independence, the Anglo-Irish War of 1919 to 21, to the Civil War that followed, 1922-23, and all the various campaigns by the IRA, not against Northern Ireland or Britain. They didn't bother with those entities. Their attacks in the 20s and 30s were all against the Free State. Later on, of course, they turned against the Northern Irish state and Britain. So there was a tradition of violence established or re-established by the Easter Rising. And that, of course, inevitably undermined constitutional nationalism. In the short run, the Redmondite Party was destroyed. In the long run, of course, we know that constitutionalism won out. In the Civil War, the pro-treaty party, led first of all by Griffith and Collins, then by Cosgrave, they won the war. They re-established the constitutionalist values, but they did so in a bloody and spectacularly brutal fashion. There was no pussyfooting around as far as the provisional government and Free State governments were concerned. They fought savagely and brutally, taking prisoners out of their cells and shooting them, just to deter other people from doing things that they weren't supposed to do. It was shocking, it was horrible, and it worked. So it undermined, in the short term, constitutionalism, although in the long run, in the Free State and Republic, that tradition did win out, and from 1923 onwards, as we all know, the Free State Republic has been a pretty normal democratic society. It enhanced the role and influence of the Irish Ireland group. The Rising, insofar as it had ideological objectives, or the rebels, Pearse above all, they were determined to revive the Irish language. And once independence had been achieved in 1922, they began imposing the Irish language, and it has been imposed and subsidized by governments ever since. Many people would think to very little effect, but that is another matter. It marginalized even further than would have been the case, or was the case anyway, other minority groups, particularly Protestants. A small minority in the 26 counties that became the Free State, and a very much smaller group in 1926 than had been the case in the previous census of 1911. Of course, the spectacular fall in the percentage of Protestants in the Free State was in part the result of the departure of the British Army, most of whose members were Protestants. Nonetheless, there was, and this is a deeply controversial area in the Republic, in certain quarters today, there was, in certain parts of the country, Cork, the Midlands, campaigns small in scale, but still nasty, horrible, against Protestant minorities. Officially, and in real terms overwhelmingly, the Protestants were well treated once things had settled down, and they became, for very many decades, a minority richer than the average population. And they went along with aspects of the Free State that they didn't like. I've mentioned the Irish language revival, for example. But there was, at least in the short term, a sectarianism that was certainly totally alien from the wishes, the habits, the attitudes of the Easter rebels themselves. There was a further marginalisation of the Irish left, of the Labour movement, Labour Party. It hadn't been particularly active, it must be said. In the first 10 years of its existence, 1912 to 22, the Irish Labour Party contested only one by-election. And then in 1922, it ran candidates and scored spectacular victories, winning 17 out of the 18 seats it contested. It seemed as if, at last, Ireland was about to become a normal society with right-left divisions. And then, a year later, 1923, the left collapsed. Civil War loyalties, Civil War commitments and prejudices predominated, as they have done ever since. And one might say that the Labour Party's spectacular record in 1922 was in part an accident. For many people, it was the only way of voting for the treaty as a result of the Collins-De Valera Pact, a complicated business. No time to go into that now. So conservative elements, effectively Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, have dominated the political life of the Free State Republic ever since. James Connolly, one of the signatories, effectively forgotten. So the priorities of people like Pearse, cultural nationalism, Tom Clark and Sean McDermott, full effective independence, constitutional independence, these are the issues that have predominated. Southern Ireland is probably always destined to be a conservative society because of its social structure. But the Easter Rising and subsequent events consolidated this pattern. And looking ahead a few months, I know historians aren't supposed to do that, but looking ahead a few months, I think we can with some confidence anticipate in the general election in the Republic that will probably take place in February, yet another annihilation of the poor old Irish Labour Party. Finally, to take up a point that Margaret Ward and questioners had raised, the role of women in Irish society. As we know, the Easter rebels were progressive and forward-looking, and in 1923, as soon as it was possible to do so, the new Irish Free State gave women the right to vote on equal terms with men. That was ahead of the United Kingdom, where that didn't come into effect until 1928-29, let alone of primitive, barbaric societies like Switzerland, where women didn't get the vote on equal terms with men until 1971. So in theory, the Free State was liberal, progressive, but in practice, this made no difference whatever, and the good wishes, the intentions of the Easter rebels were thwarted by subsequent events, by male dominance and chauvinism and arrogance. The question of Countess Markievicz and cabinet ministers and so on has been raised briefly. A final statistic, just to put that in context, I hope. Between the dismissal, the relegation of Countess Markievicz from De Valera's cabinet in August 1921 and the assumption to power of Charles Haughey in 1979, 58 years later, there was no female member of a cabinet in Dublin. So much for the wishes, the plans of the Easter rebels. I've gone fractionally over my 7 minutes, but only fractionally, so I will now make way for Richard. Thank you.